It was supposed to be a transaction like any other on the frontier. One man's debt erased in exchange for a young woman's future. But no one in Red Hollow could have guessed that the quiet cowboy who agreed to the deal would lean close on the night of their arranged wedding and whisper words that would change everything. Asterisk, I'll wait for your heart. Asterisk, the moment Clara Whitmore heard that promise, something inside her wavered, because only days earlier she had believed her life was already over. Sealed the moment her father pushed a sheet of paper across his desk and told her the truth she never imagined hearing. She had been promised in marriage to a stranger named Daniel Carter to settle the gambling debts that had swallowed their family fortune. Clara remembered standing in the doorway of that cramped office above the general store, the smell of tobacco and old ledgers hanging in the air as the afternoon sun spilled through dusty blinds, catching the ink of her own name already signed at the bottom of the agreement, a signature that had not been written by her hand, but had somehow stolen her future all the same. Her father, Robert Whitmore, couldn't meet her eyes when she asked the question that trembled in her voice. Asterisk, you sold me. Asterisk, and the silence that followed answered her more clearly than any explanation he could give. For years Clara had watched the slow collapse of their once comfortable life in Red Hollow, a small mining town that had once buzzed with hopeful prospectors and the clang of pickaxes against rock. But the silver veins had begun to dry up, and with them went the money, the optimism, and finally her father's judgment, which had disappeared at the card tables of the Rusty Lantern Saloon, where men whispered about fortunes and losses over whiskey glasses that never seemed to empty. By the time Clara realized how bad things had become, the Whitmore ranch outside town was gone, the savings were gone, and the only thing left with value in the eyes of the man her father owed money to was her hand in marriage. Yet even that arrangement had not been made with the cruel lender himself, but with another man entirely, a rancher from Blackridge Valley who had stepped in with a strange alternative contract that erased the debt if Clara married him instead. That was the explanation Robert Whitmore finally forced himself to give, though the words sounded hollow in the dim office. His name is Daniel Carter, he muttered, as if the name alone should comfort her. People say he's honorable, owns a good stretch of land north of the valley. But Clara didn't care about land or reputation or the whispers of townsfolk who believed marriage could solve everything. All she could see was the ink on that paper, the proof that her life had been traded like livestock in a market deal. Anger burned so fiercely inside her that she barely slept that night, and before the first pale streak of dawn touched the rooftops of Red Hollow, she had already saddled her horse behind the old stable, her mind fixed on one decision. If a stranger believed he could marry her because of a contract, then she would ride to his ranch and tell him to his face exactly what she thought of the arrangement. The road to Blackridge Valley stretched across miles of dusty plains and rolling hills where the wind carried the scent of sagebrush and distant cattle, and as Clara rode, she replayed every moment of the conversation with her father, the betrayal cutting deeper with each passing mile until it hardened into a resolve that steadied her hands on the reins. By late afternoon the land began to change, the harsh mining country giving way to wide open pasture land, where wooden fences traced long lines across golden grass, and a cluster of buildings stood beside a red barn beneath the shadow of low hills, the Carter Ranch. Clara slowed her horse as she approached, expecting to feel fear or uncertainty, but what filled her chest instead was a fierce determination not to be controlled by any man's bargain. She had just dismounted when the barn doors creaked open and a tall figure stepped out into the fading sunlight, dusting his hands against his jeans before removing his hat in a quiet gesture of respect. "Miss Whitmore," he said in a calm, steady voice that carried across the yard. Clara blinked in surprise. She had not expected him to recognize her immediately. The man standing before her looked nothing like the greedy opportunist she had imagined during the ride. Daniel Carter appeared younger than she expected, broad-shouldered from years of ranch work, his expression composed but not arrogant, the kind of man whose presence filled the space around him without needing loud words or swagger. "You know who I am?" she asked sharply, still gripping the saddle as if she might climb back onto the horse and leave at any moment. Daniel nodded once, almost thoughtfully. "I figured you'd come sooner or later," he replied. "Seems only fair you see the place before the wedding." The mention of the wedding made Clara's temper flare instantly. and she stepped forward until only a few feet separated them, her eyes blazing with a mixture of humiliation and fury. "Let's get something straight," she said, each word cutting through the quiet yard like the crack of a whip. "My father might have signed that contract, but he doesn't own my heart, and neither do you." For a moment Daniel didn't respond, studying her with an expression that was strangely patient rather than defensive, as if he had expected those exact words the moment she rode onto his land. Finally, he rested his hat against his hip and spoke with a calmness that unsettled her more than anger would have. "I never said I did," he answered. Clara frowned, thrown off balance by the simplicity of his reply. "Then why agree to this marriage?" she demanded, gesturing toward the house and the fields as if the entire ranch were part of some elaborate trap. Daniel glanced toward the distant hills before returning his gaze to her. "Because sometimes a contract isn't about ownership," he said quietly. "Sometimes it's about giving someone a place where they're safe." Clara didn't know what he meant by that, and the words only deepened her suspicion. Yet before she could argue further, he stepped aside and opened the front door of the ranch house with a polite nod. "You're welcome to stay as long as the agreement says," he told her, his voice gentle but firm. "But understand something, Clara Whitmore." He paused just long enough for the wind to rustle through the tall grass around them, then leaned slightly closer and spoke the words that would echo in her mind for weeks to come. "I'll wait for your heart." And in that moment, standing in the quiet yard of a ranch she had never seen before, Clara realized that the man she had come to confront was nothing like the villain she had imagined, and that frightened her far more than the contract ever had. Months earlier, Clara Whitmore had ridden into Blackridge Valley, certain the quiet rancher who agreed to marry her was simply another man taking advantage of her father's desperate gamble. Yet the longer she stayed at Daniel Carter's ranch, the harder it became to believe that story, because the man who had whispered, "I'll wait for your heart," never once behaved like someone who thought he owned any part of her life. The first days after her arrival were stiff and uncomfortable, filled with long silences and cautious glances, and Clara waited constantly for the moment when Daniel would remind her about the contract that bound them together. But that moment never came. Instead, he lived exactly the way he had before she arrived, waking before sunrise to work the ranch, checking fences that stretched across the wide valley, tending the horses, and riding out to watch over the cattle grazing in the tall grass beyond the hills. Each morning she heard the barn doors creak open while the sky was still gray with dawn, and by the time she stepped outside, he was already halfway across the fields. What confused Clara most was the freedom he gave her. He never asked where she was going when she rode into town, never demanded she help with chores, and never spoke about the wedding date that slowly crept closer on the calendar. At first, she stayed distant, convinced his patience was only temporary, but the quiet routine of ranch life slowly began to soften the anger she carried from Red Hollow. One afternoon, after a violent storm tore through Blackridge Valley, Clara walked into the pasture and found Daniel repairing a fence that had been torn apart by the wind. Broken boards lay scattered across the mud, and the cattle had wandered dangerously close to the open gap. Daniel was driving a new post into the ground with steady determination when Clara leaned against the rail and watched him work. "You know, you could hire someone to fix that," she said casually. Daniel paused long enough to wipe sweat from his brow before glancing at her with a faint smile. "Most folks around here are fixing their own fences today," he replied. Storm hit the whole valley. Clara studied him quietly as he returned to hammering the boards into place, noticing how naturally he handled the work and how little he seemed to complain about it. "So you help everyone?" she asked. Daniel shrugged lightly. "When I can." That simple answer stayed with her long after she walked back toward the house, because it didn't match the selfish man she had imagined during her ride from Red Hollow. The town of Blackridge also began to notice her presence. When she visited the general store or walked past the church on Sundays, whispers followed her through the streets. Some people believed she had been forced into the marriage. Others assumed she had tricked Daniel into it somehow. But Daniel ignored all of it. He greeted her politely each morning, shared dinner with her each evening, and never once used the contract to pressure her into anything. Slowly, Clara found herself helping around the ranch without being asked, feeding the horses, sweeping the barn floor, and sometimes riding beside Daniel as he checked the far pastures. Those quiet rides became the strangest moments of peace she had felt in months. The two of them crossing wide fields beneath endless sky, while the only sound was the steady rhythm of their horses' hoofs. Yet one question continued to linger in her mind until she could no longer ignore it. One evening as they sat beside the fireplace inside the ranch house, Clara finally asked the thing she had been wondering since the day she arrived. "Why did you really agree to the contract?" Daniel stared into the fire for a long moment before answering, as if choosing his words carefully. "Your father owed money to a man named Victor Hale," he said quietly. The name alone made Clara's stomach tighten. Even back in Red Hollow, she had heard stories about Hale, a ruthless moneylender known for destroying anyone who couldn't repay him. Daniel continued calmly. If Hale couldn't collect the debt, he would have taken something else. Clara felt a chill run through her. "And the contract was his idea?" she asked softly. Daniel shook his head. "I made sure it was." For a moment Clara didn't understand what he meant, but then the truth settled over her like a heavy weight. "You stepped in," she whispered. Daniel met her gaze across the flickering firelight. "I figured you deserved a safer place to land." The realization struck her harder than anything else she had learned since arriving at the ranch. All this time, she believed Daniel Carter had bought her future, when in reality, he had protected her from a far darker fate. That night, Clara lay awake listening to the wind move through the valley outside, replaying every moment of the past weeks with new understanding. The man she had been so determined to hate had never treated her like a bargain or a debt to be claimed. Instead, he had quietly given her something she thought she had lost the moment her father signed that paper: safety. And for the first time since the contract brought her to Blackridge Valley, Clara began to wonder if the cowboy who promised to wait for her heart might truly be the kind of man worth giving it to. Winter settled quietly over Blackridge Valley, covering the wide pastures of the Carter Ranch with a thin blanket of frost while the mountains in the distance stood pale beneath a gray sky. By then Clara Whitmore had been living at the ranch for several months, and somewhere between the early morning rides, the quiet dinners, and the long days working beside Daniel Carter, something inside her had slowly begun to change. The anger she once carried from Red Hollow no longer burned as fiercely, replaced instead by a strange sense of peace she hadn't expected to find in a place she had once believed was her prison. Daniel never rushed her, never reminded her about the contract or the approaching wedding date. True to his word, he simply waited. But peace in the valley didn't last forever. One cold afternoon, a rider appeared at the edge of the property, his dark coat whipping in the wind as he guided his horse toward the ranch house with the confidence of someone who believed he owned every place he visited. Clara felt a knot tighten in her stomach the moment she recognized him. Victor Hale. The ruthless moneylender dismounted slowly, brushing snow from his coat before glancing around the property with a thin, calculating smile. "Nice place," he said casually, his sharp eyes shifting between Clara and Daniel. "Seems my arrangement worked out well." Daniel stepped forward immediately, his posture calm but firm. "You've got no business here, Hale." The man chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the tension. "Oh, I think I do. The contract you signed was only meant to settle the debt temporarily." He turned toward Clara, his smile growing colder. "And if the young lady hasn't truly accepted her new life, the agreement returns to me." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Clara felt fear rise inside her, but something stronger pushed it back. For months she had believed she was trapped by decisions other people made: her father's mistakes, Hale's greed, and the contract that brought her to the ranch. But now she understood something important. She wasn't powerless anymore. She slowly stepped forward, standing beside Daniel rather than behind him. "You don't decide my future," she said firmly. Hale raised an eyebrow, amused. "Is that so?" Clara turned toward Daniel then, her voice softer but steady. "You told me you'd wait for my heart." Daniel nodded quietly. "I meant every word." Clara took his hand, feeling the warmth of it against the cold winter air. "Then you don't have to wait anymore." Daniel looked at her in surprise as she smiled through the emotion in her eyes. "I choose you," she said. Hale's confident expression faded instantly, because the contract had never been meant to force love, only a marriage. And Clara Whitmore had just made a choice that no contract could control. In the quiet valley, with snow drifting softly across the fields, the future she once feared had become something entirely her own.